Forprofit. First of all, really happy to be here, and wow, what an amazing place this is. I hadn't been here since the new place was here, so good for you guys. Again, my name is Marion Lewis. I'm the co-founder and CEO of BoardBookit, which is a board empowerment platform that's built to streamline best practices for companies and their board of directors. Everything from compliance and risk to the nitty-gritty of creating meetings and creating agendas and board books and securely storing their board documents. Prior to BoardBookit, I am a serial entrepreneur, so I had 3 companies and 2 successful exits out of those 3 before this one. So it's always great to talk to another group of budding entrepreneurs, and I understand some of you aren't, but for all of us, we think that board governance is a really important topic. Let me preface all of this by saying I am not a corporate secretary and I am not an attorney, so we're really going over the fundamentals here, which I think is probably all that we need to go over today, but just let you know I can't answer any legal questions. Okay, so what is board governance? Is that forwarding? Right. So this is sort of like a textbook discussion of what board governance is, but at its basics, it's really is how do you control an organization, efficiently allocate its resources, and try to eliminate the risk that's associated with both publicly and financially. And board governance empowers a board of directors organization. So it's all about creating results, and depending on the type of organization, those results may be very different. So we're going to talk a little bit about what the different types of organizations and how board governance might differ for them. Board governance is required for all public companies, obviously. I think we all know that. In the nonprofit world, there's also board governance requirements, though it's very different. So across those organizations, board governance, all those groups have boards of directors. For private companies, it's not required. But you'll see that as companies grow, they typically do get boards of directors, though they might function a little bit differently just because it's a best practice. And if you're going to look at an exit, that's one of the first things that an investor is going to look at. What kind of board governance have you done? For entrepreneurs, and I find this side, it makes it much, much easier. I just went through my Series A financing in 2017 because we used BoardBookit and we had all the documents readily available for the investors. It was a much easier process to go through due diligence. And it's a discipline for the or other people in the organization to make sure that you're tracking all of the important documents and have a central repository for them. So there are typically we look at 2 different things for both nonprofits and for-profits. I'll start with the nonprofits. Nonprofits are owned by the public to serve the public, and they're obviously very mission driven. You know, whether it's to feed the hungry, to encourage voting, whatever it might be, they are driven by mission and not by profit. Because of that, the things that they look at are very different, and most times their board members are volunteers and they're not paid. Now that can change. If you're on the Red Cross board of directors, you're probably getting paid, but for I think it's 90% of nonprofits have under $2 million in revenue. So we're talking about much smaller organizations typically, but even for the large ones, they're mission-driven, not profit-driven. If there is excess revenue generated, they try to do that. That money does not go back to the owners because the owners are the public. The excess profits go back to drive the mission of the organization. So that changes a little bit how they actually manage those organizations. It actually changes it a lot. Nonprofits are typically governed by states' attorney generals. There are state regulations. Think the Trump Foundation, they got a lot of trouble in New York, and it was the state attorney general that brought those charges against them and the sanctions against them. Now, the for-profit is what most of us are used to dealing with. So obviously, for-profit companies are typically owned by stockholders. And those stockholders may be from public companies, or they could be shareholders in privately held companies. And the sole purpose of most for-profits is to generate profit for the owners, whether those are the large stockholders or the individual stockholders. So their results are, am I making a profit, and how large is that profit? I know this sounds really basic, but when you're talking about governance, it really gets down into the nitty-gritty of what happens. So on for-profit boards, those board members are typically paid members. So if you're on the board of Salesforce or General Electric or a large publicly traded company, you're probably getting cash, and you're probably getting stock also to sit on that board. If you're a smaller company like I am, then my board members get paid with stock options because I don't have a lot of cash to pay them. And there's a whole lot of wiggle room in between there, but it's always it's rare to have a for-profit board where the board members are not compensated in some way. Profit obviously is distributed from for-profit organizations, and it's the board that decides how and when those profits do get distributed. And the stockholders typically enforce the rights of the organization, within the organization. Having said that, for publicly traded corporations particularly, they're highly regulated. So both the stock exchanges and the SEC have very strict regulations around board governance that all companies have to follow. And we'll talk just a little bit about that as we move forward. Let me just say, if anybody has questions as I'm moving along here, just raise your hand, happy to do that. So what are the key board responsibilities? And we tried to I broke these out in buckets for us. And the number one actually, and this skews a little bit more towards publicly traded companies, but it's really, most of it's applicable across all organizations. And the first, obviously, and the most important is hiring a chief executive. So while the board is responsible for everything that happens in the organization, they really need to have a lot of trust and that chief executive. So hiring the right one is going to be important. And then the other role is to provide support and resources for the chief executive to do what he needs to do. They are also responsible for the strategic vision of the corporation. Now, obviously, a lot of that work goes on within the organization among senior management level, but it's the board that needs to get involved in that and needs to sign off on the strategic direction of the organization. Then after that, it's an organizational planning. Do we have the right resources in place? Do we have the right people in place? Do we have the right people on the bus to make sure that we can achieve that strategic direction? And if we don't, how do we get those resources and how do we protect our assets? That's a really important one. So those assets can be physical, the buildings, the equipment, but more and more importantly, it's how do we protect our reputation and how do we protect ourselves from risk moving forward. The number one thing that we see, we have about 500 clients on BoardBookit. Risk is the number one thing that they're dealing with right now, whether it's risk from Me Too, climate change, cyber terrorism. That's one of the most important functions in a board right now. 10 years ago, that wasn't true, but that's like the number one priority right now. So for all the programs and services, the board has ultimate oversight. Obviously, the chief executive is bringing reports to them. But it's their ultimate responsibility for that. Enhancing the public image. And again, in this, 10 years ago, companies could ride out a scandal. It's much harder to do that now. You think Harvey Weinstein, a very successful company with the Me Too movement, with all the accusation, that company went under. They couldn't survive that. And the board actually made the decision to take that thing down. So you see a lot less leeway for chief executives and other people to do things that are ethically challenged or that might be considered morally reprehensible, because that reflects on the public image of the corporation, and boards are very, very concerned about that. Obviously, legal and ethical behavior and accountability, that's for the board as well as for all the people that work in the organization, and making sure that the systems are in place so that those behaviors become systemic. Good boards make sure that that happens. And then finally, building governance capacity and evaluating their own importance. So boards are constantly looking at, or they should be looking at, do we have the right people on the board? Are there areas of expertise that we're missing within our board? We see that a lot of boards are actually looking for people that are experienced in cyber terrorism right now. Diversity is a huge issue on boards right now. So the boards are actively thinking about how it should, their board should look, the composition of it, unfortunately, this still happens all too often. It's like there's a board seat open and everybody looks and said, well, who do you know and who do you know? So that's starting to change. and there's institutional pressures for them to change that behavior. But also, they have to evaluate their board performance on a continual basis. So best practices and institutional shareholder service, as well as most accrediting agencies, require at least an annual review of board performance. So that's from the individual board members. Are they attending meetings? Are they reading the documents that they're supposed to? As well as there's a checklist for the board itself on these are the things that a board should be doing, and are we doing them? Now, for nonprofits and for human services agencies and nonprofits, you can think large health systems, because most of those are nonprofits also. They all need to be accredited. And so if they're not doing these things, that can affect accreditation, which can affect their compensation. So it's important. For a publicly traded company, it can get you delisted. It could affect your stock price. So every single one of these are important. But particularly this last one, I think is really important too. So common board structures. So, governing boards are what we typically think of with publicly traded companies, but depending on the size of the organization, there's other boards too. Working boards, it's not unusual for some, even mid-sized companies, where it's the senior executive team is also the board. So, and they don't have outside oversight. Those are privately held companies. For some publicly traded companies, as well as companies that have governing boards or executive boards, they might have an advisory board, and this is a way for somebody to bring in expertise to help the organization, and they typically do not have voting rights, so they don't have the same fiduciary duties as a regular board would have. Fundraising boards, this is typically what you see in a nonprofit situation. When you go on a nonprofit board, and I've sat on many, they typically talk about time, treasure, and talent. How much time do you have to dedicate to this organization? What expertise do you bring to the table? And what's your network look like? How much money can you bring to the table also? And then finally, policy boards. And we see this more in wonkish kinds of organizations or companies that are going through a lot of changes. For example, the oil companies right now, a lot of them have policy boards to try to help them navigate climate change and how they're going to move forward with that. So fiduciary duties, there's really just three things that, again, this is pretty textbook. It's a duty of care, a duty of loyalty, and a duty of lawful obedience. So before you even go on a board, for a board director, that duty of care is really important. You should look at everything that you can possibly find publicly and ask for information to make sure you know what you're getting into and that this organization is doing what it's supposed to do. Once you are on the board, it's your duty to then ask the tough questions. And if you don't think that you're getting all the information that you should, then you should be very vocal about that and follow procedures to make sure that it happens. I think if we think back to the Enron days, this is what did not happen. People didn't question the chief executive or the CFO, and they got into a lot of trouble, and a lot of people lost a lot of money over that. The duty of loyalty is directors and officers have to act without personal conflict. So if you're sitting on a board, it's much harder for you, not impossible, but it's harder for you to do business with that company. And all boards, whether you're a nonprofit or a publicly traded company, are required to fill out annual conflict of interest statements. For a nonprofit, that might be a 2-page questionnaire. For a publicly traded company or a very large company, those questionnaires can be 10 and 15 pages long, where you have to disclose all of the stock that you own, any options, any warrants, any other business that you have done, anything that your family members have done. So this is something that we take more, the regulators are taking more and more seriously, and every single company does this. It was so important, it's become even more important that we've built this functionality into our tool. We did not have that when we first started, but we've since built that in there just to cover this. And then finally, the duty of lawful obedience. You have to remain faithful to what the goals organization's goals are, and not your own, or to try to guide them in a way that could benefit somebody else, even if you don't have a fiduciary interest there. So common governance committees, and these are the three that are required by the stock exchanges and most regulating authorities. And that's the audit committee, which oversees all the financial reporting and disclosure. sometimes this is combined with an executive committee, but the audit committee is required, like I said, by most regulating organizations. Compensation, this determines and improves the executive's compensation plan, definitely for the chief executive officer, and oftentimes they look at all the executive management, what their compensation is. And then nominating and governance. So this is where you do the annual and hopefully ongoing evaluation of the board of directors and examines whatever gaps there are in the skills that the organization might need. And then does the active recruiting of new board members, so nominating new people to be on the board and taking that to the full board of directors. Again, these are the three that are absolutely required. Yes?
When it comes to the compensation board, are you able to talk a little bit about how certain CEOs are able to get away with like egregiously high payments in comparison to their counterparts in that industry? Is that basically due to this board and that being in their pocket, or how does that work?
Well, I think that would certainly be something to take a look at. I mean, I think there are, philosophically, there are boards who think that this CEO is so important that we couldn't be where we're at without him, and so we're going to compensate him. Now, but they're doing that with CEOs who aren't even hitting their numbers, who are not being successful according to the metrics. There's huge pushback against this, and there has been some changes in the regulations. The push from shareholders is that they want a say in this, and they want that to stop. Institutional, ISS, which is the group that evaluates public companies every year and does a buy, sell, or a yes-no approval on all the practices within that organization. This has been a hot button for them for the last several years too, and I don't think that we've seen the last of it. That was starting to tighten up and tighten up. During the Trump administration, they have eased up some of those rules, but I think the trend is really going towards exactly what you're talking about, to have some more transparency and accountability on that CEO pay.
Is that the same for when it comes to not publicly traded companies?
No, it's not. They can pretty much do whatever they want to. There really isn't any pressure on them to do anything differently. Particularly if it's a company that's owned, like closely held, where it's one person who holds a vast majority of the stock, or a family, that by definition, they're going to get every dime they can out of that organization, pretty much. That's pretty much the way it works. And anybody else? All right, so like I said, these are the three that are required, but most boards have these committees also. So risk, and this was sort of one of the orphan committees for a long, long time. Like I said, it's one of the most important right now. So all the risk management policy of the organization, both their global operations and then both physical and cyber related. So this could be, their workers' comp plans. They're reviewing those to see what their accident rates are. They're looking at their IT infrastructure. They're looking at cybersecurity. Anything that could put the organization at risk falls under this category. So, and I can almost see when the pendulum started to shift. It was a few years ago, and it's actually been really, really good for my business because we play in that cybersecurity space. Colin Powell, who's on the board of Salesforce.com, was trading information from the board via email, which, believe it or not, is still the most common way that corporations share information about their board information. And he got hacked. And the Salesforce M&A list, proposed M&A list, went public. It was huge, and all of a sudden, everybody got really concerned. The other reason there's a lot of concern here is that shareholder lawsuits are increasing. Like I said, a lot of shareholder pressure around diversity on boards, around executive compensation. And it turns out that for board members, if they're using their personal emails for board business in the event of a shareholder litigation, all of their personal information becomes discoverable in a lawsuit. If they're working somewhere else other than the corporation they sit a board on, and most of them do, and they use a work email, then all of their work information becomes discoverable in a shareholder lawsuit. And this has happened to several board members, and all of a sudden they've become very, very concerned about mitigating that risk. So which is why board portals have really actually, they're growing at 45% a year, the adoption rate for them. And that's just one small thing. You know, there's a myriad of things. The risk with social media, the Me Too movement, all of those things, all of that would fall under the risk category. The executive committee typically is like the officers of the board and the chair of each of the committees, as well as the CEO. And those are the ones that really have the authority to make the decisions about what the organization is going to do. Typically, the full board will vote on them, but all of the real work happens within that executive committee. And then finally, the finance committee. And typically, what they're overlooking is the budgeting process and then managing that from budget to financial plan. All right, so trends. Yes?
How does the risk committee and the board interact with like a risk management group within the company? Almost all companies have that now as well.
They do, and typically risk management committees within a corporation have dealt with things like insurance risk. You know, that's been what their mandate has been. But let me just say, the boards do very little of the actual work. The work, they say, this is what we want to see, and this is what we're concerned about. That, the chief executive takes that to the people within the organization. They're doing the actual work on that. So if the risk committee says, you know, are we at risk of sexual harassment, whatever, the risk committee probably would be the one tasked, along with the HR committee, to go out and find out whether that was true or not. That make sense? Yeah. And it's going to vary by organization. You know, we see still some risk committees that are very narrowly focused, but we see that expanding quite a bit too. The cybersecurity is an obvious one. You know, that's going to cross between risk management and the IT departments. Okay. So trends for boards, and this is sort of what we're seeing right now. First of all, diversity. This is really a huge one. It's almost embarrassing how few women sit on boards, particularly publicly traded boards. I'm trying to find my here. So ISS is going to vote no on any company that doesn't, where the nominating and governance chairman does not have at least one woman on the board. So that's going to be huge. So we'll at least get one woman on all the boards because of that, because nobody wants to have a no vote on from the ISS. That's really important. Institutional shareholder services. So in publicly traded companies, that's the group that do analyst reviews with them. They're the ones that come in and review all of the things that accrediting agencies would do in nonprofits. ISS does pretty much for for-profit companies. So during proxy season, you know, the ISS is in there and making recommendations, yes or no recommendations on an organization. So there's the ones that have been pushing about the executive compensation, and they're also the ones that are now looking at diversity on boards. And until stuff like this happens, clearly diversity is not going to change. It's been some progress, but exceedingly slow because there's no incentive to do that. The environmental, social, and governance is also a really, really important one. Yeah, that is on here. So like I said, the governance we've talked about, but environmental issues and social issues are huge. You know, so climate change would fall under environmental. You know, it's really fascinating to me that, you know, while in this administration they're rolling back EPA regulations and the president has denied climate change, and I think it was Exxon that came out with a public statement saying that we believe in climate change and we're preparing for the future. It's really kind of crazy when you think about it. Social impact too, so the diversity issues, both in terms of gender and in other, you know, sexual orientation, ethnic background, race, whatever it might be. These are really important issues. And again, this is being pushed by shareholders. They're demanding that the corporate boards start to more accurately reflect what the makeup of the shareholder groups are. Before, the boards only really reacted to the institutional investors. And now the individual members of the institutional investor groups and individual shareholders are starting to demand a lot more change. Tech innovations, this is huge too. I don't know any company that isn't looking at AI right now. And I would say that, and machine learning, those are seem to be the two hot buttons right now. And then crisis management. You know, you just have to look at the last year and see all the people that have gotten in trouble. And boards now are trying to be proactive. If we have a problem, this is the people that we call in. This is how we're going to handle it. Let's see, this pretty much, some of this is getting down into the weeds a little bit. But again, these are the trends that people are looking at, new resources, that's new people for the boards, new resources for the corporation. Yeah, go ahead.
With regards to the last slide in crisis management,
Yeah.
how big do you see companies usually getting when they need something like that? Because usually smaller ones are under the radar. Have you found that preparation in young companies is better? Or have you seen any young companies prepare for crisis management or start trying to tackle these festering issues before they expand to bigger ones?
By small companies, you're talking about startups, or? No, I think startups are trying to figure out how they're going to survive for the most part. But if you're raising money, a lot of these issues are going to be addressed by your investors. When you go through due diligence, they're going to look at everything. I often said it was like getting a colonoscopy every single day when I was going through due diligence. They were very, very thorough. And so if you have any issues there, they're probably going to get uncovered. But smart CEOs look at this anyway. I mean, in this day now, you have to be kind of dense not to figure out that, you can't, well, yeah, I shouldn't say that. When you hear about some of the things that happen in tech companies and how they treat people, you would think that CEOs would be smarter, but they should be looking at that. It affects share price. It's not young companies, but I'm thinking about what happened at Uber and, some other companies like that. It's just not smart business. But real smart companies, this is not top of list for them. What it is, though, for, what kind of if any of you are planning on starting companies, start from day one. You're going to have to go through due diligence at some point if you're raising money. And if you hope to be acquired or go public or whatever you might need to do, you should start from day one thinking about these principles and being very disciplined about how you save all the documentation, whether it's NDAs or contracts or employee agreements and non-compete agreements and bylaws and corporate minutes. I mean, actually, Catherine Mott at Blue Tea told me this, and they're an investor in BoardBookit, and she said she's seeing deals actually derailed because there was absolutely companies had no corporate minutes. They had no board governance at all before they came to raise money, and investors shy away from that. So let's see. And that's my presentation. So did I get through that too fast? I'm sorry. Yes. I would be happy to. So we started BoardBookit 6 years ago in 2013, launched the product in 2014, and it's a board empowerment platform. So what that really means is we have a web-based interface for corporations to do all of the logistics that have to go with managing their board. So that's managing a board roster, assigning people to committees, managing their term limits, being able to report out on diversity, whatever it might be. So we can manage all that through BoardBookit. For board meetings or committee meetings, that's creating the agendas and creating the board books all within that web interface. Storing the documents, whether they're bylaws, financials, whatever it might be within the platform. Communications protocols are in there so that people can securely discuss issues that are associated with those documents. And there's a way for board members to communicate with each other securely so that they don't have to use those personal or private emails. So that's all stored in a really highly secured and certified environment. So we have SSAE 18 certifications and SOC 3 reports and all that sort of thing. And then on the board member side, we have the best, describing a little bit, mobile platform in the business. So we have all the features and functionality that you can access. We have a web browser that people can access their information. We also have the same functionality on an iPad, Android tablet, iPhone, Android phone, and Surface app, native, and those are all native apps. So highly usable, intuitive. Our board members don't even need training. If you can use an iPad, you can use BoardBookit to access all of your information. Yes?
Just about everybody here is, this is a lot about sustaining boards, but these are like founding boards. You have two co-founders. So day one, when you were doing your startup companies, you had two co-founders. So can you talk about starting this? Because not when the board hires a CEO, usually the CEO is.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
start there and talk about how that begins to grow and how you decide building that out. How many people?
Right, so I had one co-founder, and she's been through all 4 companies with me. So she's actually, I always say she's the brains of the operation. She's the technical person, and I tend to do all the management, the CEO role. And so it's easy, you're right. When you're starting out, it's your own money, you're throwing it in there, you're putting your time in. And then at some point you figure out that you can't bootstrap this. You're gonna need money if you're gonna grow this at all. And that's when you start to need advisors. So in this environment, what we learned in Pittsburgh, and I should say, I was very fortunate that I could fund my first 3 companies myself. And I didn't have to go through that process. For my 4th company, I probably could have done it, but it really frightened me a little bit to put that much money of my own in there. And I thought I really needed some validation from outside ourselves. And in this city, when I did some research, it was really pretty much Innovation Works. If you could get through Innovation Works and get them to fund you, then that was sort of like an imprimatur. And friends and family, that's what you do. You go out and get those people. Once you do that, once you have outside people who have invested in you, you really need to think about governance. And that's the first time that we put a board together. In the early days, we had an advisory board. In fact, they were all advisory boards till I did my Series A, I should say. But because you're going to need other industry expertise, you want people to open doors for you, that you want people that are going to short circuit the mistakes that you're going to make. So even if it's just you and a co-founder, or it's just you, I would encourage you early on, reach out to people, number one, who have done this before, and people that are going to help you to short circuit the life cycle, because there's no startup goes the way you think. It's the company you end up with is not the company that you started with. Is that what you meant, Kit?
But even this would go a little further. So usually, when you're Innovation Works, you took their money, they usually require a board seat.
They did, and they were board observers. They're not actually voting members of the board.
So that's negotiated, correct?
No, they don't take voting seats. They do not. I think because they're funded by the state, they can only take board observer seats. They don't want the legal liability of actually having the fiduciary responsibility.
Pay your advisors?
I do pay my advisors with stock options. So they all, I think it's, I can't remember, I think it's like 0.25% of the option pool goes to them. And then I pay their expenses. So all of my advisors, I'm trying to think, one's from Connecticut, 2 are from New York. And so I pay them 4 times a year to fly into Pittsburgh, and we have our board meetings. And
So do those options vest over time?
they do vest over time, but it's quicker than our regular equity incentive plan. That's I think like a 5-year vesting for the board members. It vests much, much quicker than that.
Have you ever had to get rid of somebody on the advisory board because they weren't?
Yes, it's painful. It's painful. And my view always, and it's not that they were doing a bad job. It's just that we were at a different stage in our growth. So even right now, we're looking at our board composition. We have a great product. We're selling in 5 in Africa, in Australia, in the EU, and Canada, and the United States, and we tripled our revenue last year. So we're doing really, really well. But we need sales and marketing expertise to really scale this even more. And my board doesn't have that expertise. So it's not that they weren't great up till now, but I think I need to bring somebody in that really has that, somebody that's done this before and that can help me with it.
So do you have terms?
We don't, we should, and that's one of the things that we're looking at. It's not in our bylaws, and it should be.
Usually founding boards cannot.
Exactly, yeah. So take that with you. It's a mistake that I made. I think terms are a good idea. But, and having said that, I think that whatever you do, I always try to operate from, let's be, no drama, that's my role. Let's not have any drama here and try to find a graceful way out for everybody when something like this happens, and usually that works. Okay, so there are 5 members on my board, and it's me and my co-founder. And then 2 of the seats, one of the seats is reserved for my lead investor. And the lead investor in my Series A was Golden Seeds in New York. So they always have a guaranteed seat. The second seat has to be approved by all of the Series A investors. So it doesn't have to be one of the investors, but it has to be approved by the Series A investors. And then the third seat is an independent seat. So actually, it's that independent seat that we're probably looking at replacing now and trying to get somebody with sales and marketing experience in there.
I was wondering if you could talk just a little bit about the size of the commitment when you ask somebody to be on your board, and how you can go about kind of identifying and starting a relationship with someone that you want to have on your board as an advisor.
Yeah, and the smaller you are, the harder that is, because you have to convince them it's worth their time, you know. So, you know, I would say it depends. You know, if I could get an appointment with the original VP of Sales and Marketing from Salesforce.com, I would take whatever he could give me pretty much, you know. But I'd still want to meet with them and make sure that the chemistry is good. You want to make sure that they're going to fit in with the rest of the board. And at the very least, you're going to want them, I think you should have a checklist of what you expect from your board. And if they're not going to be ready to give it to you, does it make any sense? So first of all, can they attend the board meetings? You know, are they going to have time to review all the information that you're providing to them? Are they going to be able to open doors for you? I think that probably is important if you're in your growth stage, you know. So if you're selling into a particular industry, do they have connections there? You know, or do they know other people that can get you into where you want to go? So that could be really important. If you're getting ready to go out and do a fundraise, you know, whether it's your seed round or your Series A or Series B, have they been through that before? Do they know the people in that space, and can they help guide you through that process? Or if you're considering an exit, have they done this before? Do they have relationships with investment bankers? Can they guide and advise you on that? So I think it depends on where you're at in your life cycle. Early on, I think it's people first, and I've learned this mistake or this lesson too. Make sure it's people that understand startups. You know, if you have somebody on your board that only has public company experience, and for them, it's all about hitting the numbers. That's all they really care about, because in a public company, if you miss your numbers, you're done. In a startup, you never hit your numbers. You know, you're pivoting all the time. So if that's their mindset, that's not going to be helpful to you. You know, you need somebody that's going to help you. Well, we didn't hit our numbers, but how can we pivot? The market's not what we thought it was. The messaging's not where we thought it should be. You want somebody that can help you work through those things. Yeah.
So, like I said, like BoardBookit, it's kind of a tool for more like established companies, or at least companies of a certain scale. In the early days when we had a very small board, how do you achieve the same things? What are the best practices for communicating securely and ensuring that you have all the systems you need in place before you're at a scale where it makes sense to get something like BoardBookit?
Right. Well, first of all, if you are a small startup, if you're very, very small, we'll give it to you for free, just so it's out there. Because it's never too early to worry about that. Quite, you know, but if you're very small, if your financials get out to the public, I don't know that that's really a huge issue. Even if you don't use a tool like BoardBookit, though, whether it's Dropbox or SharePoint or whatever, you know, use. Somebody actually, a guy that's not there anymore, I think he's at CMU now, he just started here. But at any rate, he told me early on, and he's like really analytical, and he said, do this and you'll never regret it, and he was right. He gave me a list of all the folders I should have in my directory, and he said, don't ever file a piece of paper, you scan it and you put it in one of those. And it was true, because then when BoardBookit launched, I took all that stuff and I just put it into BoardBookit. And it just makes it a whole lot easier. Because trust me, that first time you go through due diligence, and you've been probably operating for a year or two, and they ask for everything, and you have to go back and find it and recreate it. I mean, it could be months of work. It really can. So you should do that right from the get-go.
I did check
You know, I don't know. I think that we actually might have written some blogs about that. I'll see. I can share them with Allison or something if she can get those to you. Yeah. Yeah.
Back to your advisor
Uh-huh.
team. You mentioned that startups, are always you're always pivoting. It sounds like the nature of the job is somewhat abstract, but when you're bringing someone onto your team, do you have deliverables that they need to meet for that, quarter of a percentage point or something like that? Like for instance, if you want to bring them on for sales, you say like, oh, I'm expecting, at least 10%, 10 leads from you or something like that.
I have never done that. I doubt that anybody would, I've never heard of that, ever, no. Well, here's the thing, they're getting the stock options, it's a commitment to serve on a board. And I think that, to her point, you should meet with them ahead of time, and it should be more than one conversation. Make sure that you have a really good rapport and they understand what you're trying to achieve. They should be just as invested in your success as you are. And if they're not, you don't want them on your board no matter how, well, a big name might help you with fundraising, but you really, when you're this small or just starting out, you want people that are going to help you, in my opinion. Yeah, Kit?
Make a comment on that too. In the beginning, very control was to eventually, if you start taking like VC money, medical fees, because
Absolutely.
75% of CEOs that are invested in VCs are the price per year of the VC investment.
Mm-hmm.
So their job is to do what's best for the company, not necessarily for you. So careful who you take on.
Absolutely.
And just as a little plug to sort of follow on some of these questions, we have come into them actually with the rest of the BoardBookit, but what we have found when we're doing due diligence on the companies, what really slows down the actual closing deal is how sloppy the back office management is, all the documentation that you need to do go through due diligence, and so it hurts you unless you either use something like this or start getting it right to start out with. To that end, start smart. That is soon, but I can't remember when it's on the schedule when it comes out. It's called preparing for an exit. But in essence, when you start your company, you do that preparation. So Marion brought up everything that can kind of go wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a little bit of get it right at the beginning.
It's much easier now. I started my first company 25 years ago, and we were still doing accounting by hand, and it was the dark ages, and it was expensive to buy systems. I remember the first computer that we bought was a Mac, and it was $12,000, if you can imagine that. We're buying laptops for $600. But now everything's in the cloud, so everything that you need to use you can find at low cost or free, and I would encourage you to do it right from the beginning, from your accounting systems to your CRM to everything that you're going to have to use, even your leave management policies. We probably pay for 50 different cloud-based services to manage the company now, but when you're starting out, probably 3 or 4 or 5 of those are what you need to really get you going and give you the discipline to start right from get-go. It's always harder to go back and try to recreate than if you just start from the beginning. Yeah.
Joan, I'm with a company called Maven Machines, tech startup in the tracking industry.
Yeah, we pitched together at IW, remember? Yeah.
And so, kind of what you're saying, I'm like nodding along because a lot of it clicks. I'm kind of curious on the customer advisory boards. We've been talking on our board about starting it up, and we've had a couple customers kind of talk about, they need to be on a customer advisory board. Do you have any personal experience with customer advisory boards or best practices, do's, don'ts?
Yeah, we used them in previous companies. We're just starting one now. We didn't think that we were ready to do one until now. I think they're great. I think you need to have a big enough customer base to make it make sense, and also to be very specific about what is it that you want to get from your customer advisory board. The worst thing you can do is like convene meetings when there's no like structured agenda, and you need to work out in your head, what is the end result that I want to get from these people? Whether it's, documentation that you can then roll out to prospects or to other customers, whatever it might be. But there's, and I think there's a lot online that you can read about this, but really have done, and I'd put it all in writing to share with the people that are coming on the board, saying this is what the board's going to do. What an honor it is, you know, and we're so thrilled you've agreed, but this is what the work is going to be and what we're going to do with the results of what our meetings are. Yeah, I think they're a great idea, like I said, but they can be tricky. And you know, they want to, we did one early on where it was just like we hadn't thought that through enough, and the people started saying, what are we doing here? And we weren't even quite sure, you know, so that was a long time ago, but that's my learning. Yeah, anything else? No? Oh, thank you, this was really nice. And good luck to all of you. If I can help in any way, as you're rolling out those new companies,